Hello friends and welcome back to Generation Pixel, and today, well, I'm going to answer a question. You see, the community has asked, is retro collecting worth it in 2021? Well, I'm going to answer that question, but because it's going to be a fairly simple answer for me, I'm going to look at two other aspects of retro gaming, which will give us a quick look at how to retro game in 2021 and the overall state of retro gaming in 2021. So if you're looking forward to see my answers to those questions, then just wait until after the titles. Okay, so point number one, the question from the community, is retro collecting worth it? Well, for me, the answer's quite simple. Well, of course it's worth it, depending on the item. Now you see, what I do with any question in life is have an imaginary set of scales. On one side I have, does this bring me joy? And on the other side I have, does this do any harm? Now as long as the joy outweighs the harm by a significant deal, then I don't see why something wouldn't be worth it. Now I do know there's some other things that you have to take into consideration rather than just the joy-harm formula, such as strange fluctuations in prices, especially due to, what's been going on in the world for the last year and a bit. And of course there's always going to be trends on certain systems and on certain software, so again you have to keep your eye on that. But on the whole, if it brings you joy and it doesn't do you any harm, then yes, it's worth it, because what's the point of living in the world if it's not one that's filled with joy? So when you ask yourself that question, or any other one in life, if you find that the joy outweighs the harm, then I can see no reason for you not to do whatever it is that you choose to do. Now that question was far too easy for me to answer to end the video here, because otherwise it'd be quite a short one. So I've decided to look at two other aspects, as I said in the introduction, and the first one being, how do we retro game in 2021? And of course, we have three main ways to retro game in 2021. The first being the purest way, and that is to have original hardware with original software on a CRT, which is, let's face it, original hardware. Number two is at the opposite end of that scale, and that is emulation. Now we have countless numbers of emulation devices and emulation software, and just about every game in history has a ROM out there floating in the ether, ready to be plucked and played at any time. And thirdly, we have the halfway ground, where we have original hardware and software, but we run it on modern displays. Now to be frankly honest, I have no issue with any gamer who uses either only original hardware or software on a CRT. I have no issues with people who are using original hardware and software with devices that help them play on modern screens, and I have absolutely no issue with people who emulate, as I myself use all three methods depending on what I'm playing and why I'm playing it. Now of course, there are drawbacks to each of these methods of gaming, so let's have a look at them individually. Now for the purist, the main drawback can be price. Original software and hardware can be extremely pricey, and even the price of a CRT is quite elevated at the moment. And then on top of that, the original hardware and of course the CRTs, well, they're dying off. A lot of these components were put together 30 or 40 years ago, and the further into time we go, the more and more will fail. Now fortunately we do have people out there who can maintain these machines, but on the whole it's getting rarer and rarer to see original hardware and original software. So price is without a doubt the biggest drawback of being a purist retro gamer. Now the issues on the emulation side is one, well, the legality of it, because at the end of the day you are playing software that you haven't paid a license to play. And even having ownership of the original software is still a sort of grey area in the law when it comes to running an emulated program. And a second drawback, well, it's not exactly the game that was designed to be played, and the reason for that, people have tinkered. Everything from changing the aspect ever so slightly, or to adding things such as save states, so you're not actually playing the original game. And then of course the middle ground, where you're using original hardware and software but on a modern screen. Now the drawbacks with this is pretty much the same as the purist. The hardware and software will become more rare and more expensive, and eventually one day they just might not be there. but for me this middle road is my preferred way to play retro games. Because yes, I'm using original hardware and software, but I no longer need a bulky and sometimes expensive CRT display. But the second problem with this middle route is choosing a device that is right for the software and the hardware you're trying to emulate, or at least run on a modern screen. If you've ever had a look for yourself, you've probably seen there's a whole host of devices that allegedly upscale retro consoles to HD output, and these range in price anywhere from about £10 up to £200, maybe even £250. So what I'd like to do today is, because this is the route that I like to take, is show two of these devices at two different price points, and those devices are the original drawing video. Now this device here, as you can see, takes in Composite and Component and S-Video. It feeds out of course to HDMI, and it has switches there which will change the frequency, and of course it multiplies the number of lines, or allegedly. So we have the ODV at £50. The second device I'm going to show you is the Retro Tink 2X, or 2 times, because it's a line doubler as well. And again, you look, it's slightly different to the first one. As you see, the exposed printed circuit board and the chips that you can see in there, but also it takes Composite and Component and S-Video. It also has switches hidden inside there which do pretty much the same as the ODV, but this device here will cost you in the region of £100. So what I'm going to do now is run a little video footage of these two devices running side by side on different original hardware at different settings with different cables. So let's run that video. So what we're going to see in the screen coming up is 4 screens, 2 at the top being the Retro Tink, 2 at the bottom being the ODV. Now on the left hand side you have the PlayStation 1 running through Composite cables, and on the right hand side we're going to have the PlayStation 2 running a PlayStation 1 game through Component cables. Now one of the biggest drawbacks of retro gaming is text, of course. It doesn't scale well, but with these two devices, as you can see, it does quite a good job. And from the comparison you can see fairly clearly that the Composite cables don't quite perform as well as the Component cables, but both sets of cables do an adequate enough job of upscaling the text on screen. Now when we're looking at the cutscenes coming through both sets of cables and both devices, we can see immediately that the bottom 2 screens, the ODV screens, are just a little bit brighter. They do however lose a little bit of contrast. On the whole however, both devices and both sets of cables manage the cutscenes quite well. For a proper evaluation however, we will need to zoom in and we will need to look at a still image. And looking at these images side by side, we can get a clearer representation of what each set of cables and what each device can do. And from here we can see quite clearly that the Retro Tink is both a little bit sharper and has a little bit better contrast than the ODV. And feel free to freeze frame to see for yourself. When the cutscenes are in motion, this hides a lot of the deficiencies that the cheaper ODV has. And to be honest, it also hides the deficiencies between the Composite cables and the Component cables. Now saying that, PlayStation 1 games aren't designed to run off Component cables. So the very fact that both these devices can output a component signal from a PlayStation 1 game is quite remarkable in itself. But that is not the end of the story when it comes to PlayStation 1 through Component cables, but that's for a little later on. Now gameplay scenes are where you see the biggest differences between both devices and both sets of cables. Again, as with the cutscenes, you can see the differences between both the lightness and the contrast between the Retro Tink and the ODV. And although slight, there is also a sharpness difference between the Retro Tink and the ODV. But when you zoom into a level where you would likely be playing the game, you can see that the softness in the ODV is much more pronounced. The Retro Tink is far more defined at greater levels of zoom, whereas it looks like the ODV has a slight soft focus. Again, feel free to scan back and freeze frame to check for yourself. Now we need to look not so much between the Retro Tink and the ODV, but between the composite and the component cables that are outputting a PlayStation 1 game. And this is where, unfortunately, the component cables let themselves down a bit. And the reason that they let themselves down is due to the fact that they're just a tad too sharp. Now you might not have noticed this too much during the recent gameplay footage, but if you take a look at these still shots that are zoomed in to a level closer to what you would be playing the game, then you can see quite clearly the sharpness of the component cables through the Retro Tink deliver quite a pixelated look. So there you go, two different devices at different ends of the pricing spectrum. Not vastly different ends, it wasn't a £10 one versus a £250 one, but you got to see what you can get for your money, and hopefully it will show you something that you might be interested in yourself. But anyway, that brings us to the end of that point, and that's how we retro game in 2021. And the last piece I want to talk about is the state of retro gaming in 2021. Now for me, it doesn't matter if you're a purist believing that only original hardware on original software is the way to go, or the emulation's the only way to go, or a mix of the both. At the end of the day, what we're doing as retro gamers is we have a passion to play those games and also want to have access to those games, whether it's in a physical collection or in a big ROM dump where we can at any given time just sit down and play that classic game that we want to play. So you see, that's where we come together as gamers. We all have the same outcome in the end, or we're all looking for the same outcome, and that is to be able to play the games that we know, love and want to play. Now unfortunately, there's three major players and they have full control over not only the state of retro gaming currently, but in the future as well. And that is quite simply Nintendo, Microsoft and Sony. Because you see, we can collect as much as we want and we can dump as many ROMs as we can onto whatever devices, because at the end of the day, no matter how much we collect and look after, no matter how many ROMs we dump onto whatever systems, without the support of the three major console manufacturers, retro gaming will always, as we say in Scotland, be on a sugary peg. Now both Microsoft and Nintendo at the moment both seem to have a modicum of care about their legacy software, which can be seen in the decent backwards compatibility attempts both of them have made. The most worrying one, of course, is Sony, and it's sad for me to say, because I've been fairly Sony brand loyal since the launch of the PlayStation. And I think as far as Sony's concerned at the moment, we're at a pivotal moment. Now in the summer of this year, we're going to lose the PlayStation 3, PSP and PlayStation Vita stores. Now we will still have access to the games that were bought in those stores, and we will still be able to download them onto the legacy console. In other words, we'll be able to download them onto our PlayStation 3, our PSP or our Vita. But even that of course comes with the same problem, that the hardware won't last forever. But the real pivot point is the rumour that Sony might be looking at backwards compatibility for PlayStation 1, 2 and 3, which will be accessible on the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5. Now as I've said time and time again, I am Sony brand loyal. But anyone out there who knows anyone who works for Sony, or if anyone who works for Sony watches this, please tell Jim Ryan he has no idea what he's talking about when it comes to gaming. It's not about the graphical fidelity of the games, it's not about the length of the games, it's not about even the soundtracks, it's about the playability of the game. It's always been about the playability of the game, and it will always be about the playability of the game, because gameplay is king. So that brings us to the end of the 3 topics that I would like to discuss today. Now, if there's anything that I spoke about today that you disagree with, then down in the comments, fire away. I'll get back to you. I mean, have a look at the comments that I reply to, because as a content creator, nothing inspires me more than the interaction with the rest of the community. And of course, if you've liked this video, throw that thumbs up, because it means a great deal to every one of us out here who are creating content for YouTube. And of course, if you want to see more content like this, and also content different to this, as there will be some suggested videos at the end of this. Anyway, thank you again for your time, and until next time, cheerio!